Emma Whittaker clutched her newborn son to her chest, her weary eyes drifting to the window of her modest Topeka home. Outside, Kansas dust swirled in the September heat of 1886, the dry spell having lasted weeks longer than anyone had predicted. Like many in Topeka that year, Emma's husband James worked for the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, the iron beast that had transformed their prairie town into a growing city of nearly 20,000 souls. "He's perfect, Emma," her mother Martha said softly, adjusting the blanket around the infant. "Little William has your eyes." Emma nodded, still weak from the difficult birth 3 days prior. Dr. Peterson had warned there might be complications. At 38, Emma was considered old for a first-time mother, but William had arrived healthy, if somewhat small, his piercing cries filling their bedroom as the midwife and doctor attended to them both. "The blanket," Emma whispered, her fingers tracing the peculiar pattern that adorned its edges. "Where did it come from?" Martha's brow furrowed. "It was with the package that arrived last week. From your aunt in Boston, remember? I laid it out with the other baby things." Emma shook her head slowly. "No, this isn't Aunt Catherine's work. Look at it, Mother." Martha leaned closer, adjusting her spectacles. The blanket was soft cotton, expertly woven, but the border pattern was unlike anything she had seen before. Instead of the traditional florals or simple geometric designs common in their time, this pattern featured interlocking shapes that seemed to shift before her eyes. It wasn't the familiar patchwork or embroidery seen at the county fair. These were precise, almost mathematical arrangements of triangles and lines that formed larger, more complex structures. "Perhaps it's a new design from back east," Martha offered, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "You know how Boston likes its modern ways." Emma didn't respond, her attention drawn to a small marking in the corner of the blanket. Not a seamstress's signature or a laundry mark, but something that resembled a date. 11/12/45. November 12th, 1845. That made little sense. The blanket was clearly new, its cotton still crisp and bright. "Did James mention ordering something special?" Martha asked, moving to prepare tea on the cast-iron stove that dominated the small kitchen. "No," Emma replied. "With the railway cutting wages again, he's been careful with every penny. He wouldn't have purchased something so fine without telling me." The baby stirred, his tiny fist escaping the confines of the blanket. Emma adjusted it, noticing how the strange pattern seemed to frame her child's face perfectly, as if designed specifically for him. A knock at the door startled both women. Martha crossed the worn wooden floor, smoothing her apron before opening it to reveal Sarah Cunningham, their neighbor and wife of the local general store owner. "I heard the little one had arrived," Sarah said, stepping inside with a basket covered in gingham cloth. "I've brought some bread and preserves." "How are you feeling, Emma?" "Better each day," Emma replied with a tired smile. "Come meet William." Sarah approached, setting down her basket before peering at the infant. Her expression changed instantly, a sharp intake of breath causing Emma to look up in alarm. "What is it?" Sarah's fingers hovered over the blanket, not quite touching it. "This pattern. Where did you get this?" Something in Sarah's tone made Emma's heart quicken. "It came with some baby things last week." "Why? What's wrong with it?" Sarah hesitated, her usually animated face suddenly guarded. "Nothing's wrong. It just reminded me of something, that's all." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A design I saw once. In a book." "What book?" Martha asked, returning with the tea. "An old one, from my grandfather's collection." Sarah seemed eager to change the subject. "He traveled extensively before settling here. The pattern is probably European, nothing to fuss about." But Emma noticed how Sarah's eyes kept returning to the blanket throughout her visit, how her conversation became distracted whenever William moved, and the pattern caught the afternoon light. After Sarah left, Emma laid William in the handmade cradle beside her bed. James wouldn't be home until late. The railroad was pushing its men hard to complete the new Western line before winter. She had time to inspect the blanket more thoroughly. Spreading it out on the bed, Emma was struck again by its uniqueness. The pattern wasn't just unusual, it felt deliberate, the shapes arranged with purpose. Some sections reminded her of the constellations James had pointed out during their courtship walks, while others suggested a map of sorts, though not of any place she recognized. The marking in the corner, 11-12-45, drew her attention again. She ran her fingers over it, feeling the slight indentation where the numbers had been stitched with a different technique than the rest of the blanket. A memory stirred. 5 years earlier, before moving to Topeka, Emma had worked as a teacher in Lawrence. One of her colleagues, Professor Jenkins, from the newly established University of Kansas, had shown her photographs taken with a new camera, the first she'd ever seen. The images had fascinated her, but what struck her now was the small notation Jenkins had placed on each photograph, the date, written in the same format as the marking on the blanket. But that would make the date November 12th, 1945, nearly 60 years in the future. Emma shook her head at her foolishness. It was clearly a manufacturing code or inventory number, nothing more. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the blanket was somehow out of place, as if it had arrived from somewhere or somewhen else. William began to fuss, his tiny face reddening with imminent cries. Emma gathered him up, the blanket still wrapped around him, and began to rock gently in the chair James had made when they'd learned of her pregnancy. As she hummed a lullaby her own mother had sung, her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her. She dreamed of a vast building filled with thundering machines, women in strange trousers operating devices that wove fabric at impossible speeds. In her dream, she walked among them unseen, watching as one woman programmed a particular pattern into a machine, the very pattern that now adorned William's blanket. Emma jolted awake at the sound of the front door. Dusk had fallen, and James's heavy footsteps crossed the floor as he removed his boots. "How are my treasures?" he asked softly, appearing in the bedroom doorway, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes warming at the sight of his wife and son. "We're well," Emma replied, carefully transferring the sleeping infant to his arms. "James, do you recognize this pattern?" James studied the blanket, his calloused fingers gentle against the fabric. "Can't say that I do. Fancy work, though. Must have cost a pretty penny." "That's just it. I don't know where it came from. It was with Aunt Catherine's package, but it's not her style at all, and look at this marking." She pointed to the corner. James squinted in the dim lamplight. "Looks like a date, written the way those photographer fellows do. Could be a model number, though." "I thought so too, but—" Emma hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. How could she explain her dream, the strange certainty that the blanket didn't belong in their time? "But what?" James prompted, shifting William to his shoulder. "Nothing. I'm just tired, I suppose. The birth was hard and I haven't been sleeping well." James kissed her forehead. "You need rest, Em. I'll take the night shift with this little man. You sleep." Emma nodded gratefully, though she doubted sleep would come easily. As James walked William around the small house, she found herself returning to the blanket, searching for any other clues, any manufacturer's mark or signature that might explain its origin. She found nothing until, holding it up to the lamplight, she noticed the faintest of watermarks visible only when the fabric was backlit, a small symbol that resembled a stylized atom, with circular paths around a central point. Emma had seen something similar in a scientific journal James had brought home from the railway's reading room, an article speculating about the structure of matter itself. But what would such a symbol be doing on a baby's blanket in 1886? Emma didn't realize she had spoken aloud until James answered from the doorway. "What's that about a blanket?" She turned, the fabric still held to the light. "This symbol. It looks like that diagram from Harper's, the one about atoms." James crossed to her, William still nestled against his shoulder. "You're right," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "That's mighty peculiar for a baby blanket." And there's more," Emma said, showing him how the pattern, when viewed as a whole, seemed to form larger structures. It's as if it's trying to tell us something. James was silent for a long moment. My grandmother used to tell stories, he finally said, his voice low. Creek Indian stories, from her people. She spoke of objects that traveled between worlds, carrying messages across time. Emma stared at him. James rarely mentioned his grandmother's heritage, having learned early that such acknowledgement brought nothing but trouble in white society. You think this blanket is such an object? She asked, trying to keep the skepticism from her voice. I think, James said carefully, that there are more things in heaven and earth than we understand, Em, and I think we should be careful with what we don't understand. Outside, a distant whistle signaled a train's departure from the Topeka station. William stirred but didn't wake, comforted by his father's steady heartbeat. Should we get rid of it? Emma asked, though the thought of parting with the blanket filled her with inexplicable dread. James considered for a moment, then shook his head. No, if it was meant to find us, there must be a reason. My grandmother would say we should respect that. That night, as James and William slept, Emma sat by the window, the blanket in her lap, staring at the pattern that shouldn't exist. Beyond their small home, Topeka stretched into the darkness, a city transforming from frontier town to modern hub. Unaware that in a modest house on its outskirts, a woman contemplated a mystery that transcended time itself. In the distance, another train whistle sounded, its mournful cry echoing across the Kansas plains, carrying with it a question Emma couldn't yet formulate, but somehow knew was vital. Why had this impossible object found its way to her child, and what did it mean for his future? October brought the first frost to Topeka, the morning air crisp as Emma hung laundry in the yard, William bundled in his cradle nearby. The mysterious blanket was tucked safely in a cedar chest, brought out only when Emma was alone and could study it without interruption. She had written to Aunt Catherine in Boston, inquiring about the blanket's origin, but the response, received just yesterday, had only deepened the mystery. Catherine claimed no knowledge of such a pattern, stating firmly that she had sent only a christening gown and 2 plain muslin swaddling cloths. Talking to yourself again, Emma Whittaker? The voice startled her, and Emma turned to find Ida Johnson at the garden gate, market basket in hand. Ida, the telegraph operator's wife, was Topeka's most reliable source of gossip, her visits both welcomed and dreaded for the information they invariably delivered. Good morning, Ida, Emma replied, pinning a sheet to the line, just singing to William. Ida approached the cradle, cooing appropriately at the sleeping infant before leaning closer to Emma. I heard something at the telegraph office yesterday, something about Sarah Cunningham's grandfather. Emma paused, a damp pillowcase forgotten in her hands. Sarah had barely visited since that first day, offering vague excuses when invited for tea. What about him? Well, Ida lowered her voice conspiratorially. Apparently he wasn't just a traveller. Thomas Cunningham was involved in government work, secret work, during the war between the states. Something to do with codes and patterns. Patterns? Emma repeated, her mind immediately going to William's blanket. According to Charles, that's my husband, you know, Thomas had some unusual ideas about communication. Believed patterns could contain messages, information that could be hidden in plain sight. Emma's heart raced. Did Charles say what kind of patterns? Ida shrugged. Nothing specific, just that after the war, Thomas became obsessed with the idea, claimed he'd seen evidence of messages sent across vast distances, even across time itself. She laughed. Sounds like the ravings of an old man, doesn't it? But Sarah always was protective of his papers, keeps them locked in a special cabinet in their home. Emma forced a smile. People develop strange notions as they age. Indeed they do. Speaking of strange, Ida glanced around, ensuring they were alone. Have you heard about Dr. Peterson's new patient? A woman arrived on Monday's train, heavily pregnant and in distress. Claims she's from somewhere called Wichita, but has no identification, no husband, and wears the oddest clothing. Dr. Peterson took her in out of Christian charity, but the town council is concerned. Wichita is real, Emma said. It's a settlement southwest of here. Is it now? Well, this woman speaks strangely and asked for something called an ultrasound. Dr. Peterson thought she might be foreign, but she speaks perfect English, just with unusual phrases. Ida adjusted her bonnet. They say she was carrying a book with impossible dates and information. Mayor Baxter wanted to have her committed, but Mrs. Peterson insisted on sheltering her until the baby comes. Emma's hands trembled as she pinned the pillowcase. What's her name, this woman? Elizabeth, I believe. Elizabeth Parker. Ida gathered her basket. I should continue to market before the best cuts are gone. Give my regards to James. As Ida departed, Emma stood motionless beside the laundry line, her mind racing. A woman with strange clothes and speech, carrying a book with impossible dates, from a place called Wichita that few in Topeka recognized. It couldn't be coincidence. That evening, after James had gone to his weekly meeting at the Masonic Lodge, Emma wrapped William warmly and walked the 8 blocks to Dr. Peterson's home and surgery. Lights burned in the front parlor, and Emma hesitated before climbing the steps and knocking softly. Mrs. Peterson answered, her kind face showing surprise. Emma, should you be walking such a distance so soon? Is William well? We're both fine, Mrs. Peterson, Emma assured her. I heard about your guest, the woman from Wichita. Something flickered in Mrs. Peterson's eyes. Caution, perhaps. News travels quickly in Topeka. May I speak with her? Please. It's important. Mrs. Peterson studied Emma for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. 5 minutes only. She needs rest. She led Emma through the house to a small bedroom at the rear, knocking gently before entering. The woman inside sat by the window, her swollen belly prominent beneath a nightgown borrowed from Mrs. Peterson. She was young, younger than Emma, with short hair cut in a style Emma had never seen before. But it was her eyes that captured Emma's attention, intelligent, fearful, and filled with the same confusion Emma had felt when examining William's blanket. Elizabeth, this is Mrs. Whitaker from down the street. She has a new baby and thought you might like some company. Elizabeth nodded cautiously as Emma seated herself in the room's other chair. I'll bring tea, Mrs. Peterson said, leaving them alone. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Emma reached into her shawl and withdrew a corner of William's blanket. I believe this might be connected to you, she said quietly. Elizabeth's eyes widened, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. Where did you get that? It arrived with my baby's things. The pattern, it's not from our time, is it? The younger woman's face crumpled, tears welling. You know. How can you possibly know? The marking in the corner, the atomic symbol. And now you, arriving from nowhere. Emma leaned forward. Elizabeth, where are you from? When are you from? Elizabeth wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Wichita, Kansas, 2023. Despite having suspected something impossible, Emma felt the room spin. How? I don't know, Elizabeth whispered. I was at the Museum of Science and Technology. We were on a field trip, my high school history class. There was an exhibit about quantum entanglement, with these fabrics woven using algorithms based on quantum patterns. She touched the blanket reverently. Patterns like this one. But how did you come here? To 1886. Elizabeth shook her head. I felt dizzy in the museum. The patterns were moving, or seemed to be. I went to find a bathroom and opened a door. And then I was standing on a dirt road outside a town. A wagon driver found me and brought me to Topeka. That was 4 days ago. Fresh tears flowed. My baby is due in 3 weeks. How will I get home? How will I raise a child here? Emma's mind raced. The blanket came first, then you. There must be a connection, a way to reverse whatever brought you here. The woman at the museum, Elizabeth said suddenly. The guide. She said the patterns were based on theoretical work by someone named Cunningham, a scientist who believed certain mathematical sequences could create bridges, she called them, across space and time. Cunningham, Emma breathed. Thomas Cunningham. You know him? He lived here in Topeka. His granddaughter Sarah is my neighbor. Elizabeth's expression transformed, hope flickering. Then his research, it might exist here, if we could find it. Footsteps in the hallway announced Mrs. Peterson's return. Emma quickly tucked the blanket away, squeezing Elizabeth's hand. I'll come back tomorrow. We'll figure this out together. The following day, Emma found a reason to visit the Cunningham store, William in her arms as she browsed fabric bolts. Sarah was alone behind the counter, her husband having gone to order new stock from Kansas City. I need something special, Emma said, approaching the counter. Something with an unusual pattern. Sarah looked up sharply. For the baby? In a way. I'm interested in patterns that might contain messages. The storekeeper's face paled. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Sarah. I met someone yesterday. Someone who doesn't belong here, just like the blanket doesn't belong here. Sarah's eyes darted to the store windows, ensuring they were alone. You shouldn't speak of such things, Emma. Some knowledge is dangerous. Your grandfather didn't think so. He believed patterns could bridge impossible distances. My grandfather was brilliant, Sarah hissed, leaning across the counter, and he nearly destroyed himself pursuing those ideas. Do you know what happened to him? He disappeared for 3 months in 1863. When he returned, he was changed, claimed he'd seen the future, that there were doorways hidden in mathematical sequences. What if he was right? Emma persisted. What if his work could help someone return to where they belong? Sarah studied Emma intently. The blanket, it found you for a reason. It wasn't a question. I believe it did. After a long moment, Sarah sighed. Come to my home tonight, after closing. Bring the blanket, and this person you've met. I can't promise anything, but grandfather's journals might contain answers. That evening, James insisted on accompanying Emma to the Cunningham residence, his protective instincts heightened by the unusual circumstances. Elizabeth arrived separately, escorted by Dr. Peterson himself, who had been sworn to secrecy about the meeting. Sarah led them to a study filled with books and papers, dominated by a large desk covered in diagrams. These were my grandfather's, she explained, unlocking a cabinet to reveal leather-bound journals. He called it quantum entanglement theory, though such terminology wasn't used in his time. It's used in mine, Elizabeth said softly. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. How far? 2023. Dr. Peterson made a strangled sound, but Sarah merely nodded again. Grandfather suspected his patterns could bridge up to 150 years. He found evidence of objects moving through time, small things at first, then larger items. Like people? James asked, his expression guarded. There were rumors during the war, Sarah admitted. Union operatives appearing with information they couldn't possibly have obtained, vanishing just as mysteriously. She spread William's blanket on the desk, smoothing its folds. This pattern is more complex than any in grandfather's journals. The mathematics behind it would be beyond his calculations. It's from a museum exhibit, Elizabeth explained, based on computational algorithms that took decades to develop. Then it's more powerful than anything grandfather created, Sarah mused. A doorway, perhaps, rather than merely a message. Emma felt a chill. A doorway to what? To when, Dr. Peterson corrected, examining the pattern with newfound interest. If Thomas's theories were correct, certain mathematical sequences create points of temporal instability, moments where the barriers between different times thin. Like the equinox for the veil between worlds, James murmured, earning surprised looks from the others. My grandmother's teachings, he explained, somewhat defensively. Not entirely dissimilar, Sarah agreed. Grandfather believed these patterns needed to be activated, usually by proximity to certain electromagnetic fields. The museum had an electromagnetic exhibit next to the quantum textiles, Elizabeth recalled, and I was wearing this. She pulled a necklace from beneath her borrowed dress, a simple pendant with a geometric design etched into metal. Sarah gasped. "That's grandfather's symbol." It was part of the exhibit, a replica of the Cunningham medallion. "I bought it in the gift shop." Elizabeth looked down at her stomach. "I was wearing it when I traveled." "And the blanket bears the same fundamental pattern," Sarah said, excitement building in her voice. "If grandfather was right, these objects are connected across time, entangled, to use his terminology. Where one goes, the other might follow." "Or lead," Emma suggested, thinking of how the blanket had arrived before Elizabeth. "So the blanket could be a way home for Elizabeth?" James asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Sarah hesitated. "Possibly, but grandfather's notes suggest that temporal transit requires specific conditions. The pattern alone isn't enough. There needs to be a focal point, a concentration of the right energies." "Like what?" Dr. Peterson demanded. "Electrical storms, certain geological formations, or—" Sarah turned to a specific page in her grandfather's journal. "Railway junctions, where multiple lines converge, creating unique electromagnetic fields." James straightened. "The new Western Junction. It's being completed next week, 5 lines converging at a single point, the largest such junction west of Chicago." "When exactly?" Sarah asked intently. "November 12th. They're holding a ceremony to drive the final spike." Emma and Elizabeth exchanged startled glances. "The date on the blanket," Emma whispered. 11/12. That can't be coincidence." "We're missing something," Sarah muttered, flipping through the journal. "The full marking was 11 to 12:45, correct? But if the junction opening is November 12th, 1886, what if it's not a date at all?" Dr. Peterson suggested. "What if it's coordinates?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Or a time, 11:12 and 45 seconds. "At the junction ceremony," James added, "when all attention will be on the final spike, when the convergence will be at its strongest." Elizabeth placed a protective hand on her belly. "So, I need to be at this junction, with the blanket and medallion, at exactly 11:12 and 45 seconds on November 12th. "It's our best theory," Sarah admitted. "But Elizabeth, you must understand, grandfather's work was theoretical. If we're wrong—" "If you're wrong, I'm still stranded here," Elizabeth said firmly. "But if you're right—" Her voice caught. "I could go home." As the group discussed logistics, Emma found herself staring at William, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, unaware of the impossible conversations swirling around him. The blanket had come to him first, had wrapped her child in its impossible pattern. What did that mean for his future? Outside, a train whistle cut through the night, its mournful cry seeming to echo the uncertainty they all felt. The junction ceremony was 9 days away. 9 days to prepare, to hope, to fear what might happen when pattern met pattern at the appointed time. And through it all, one question burned in Emma's mind. If the blanket had found William for a reason, what would happen when it, and Elizabeth, departed? The 9 days before the junction ceremony passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Sarah delved deeper into her grandfather's journals, searching for any details that might increase their chances of success. James, using his position with the railway, obtained passes for all of them to attend the ceremony, claiming Emma had a special interest in witnessing this historic moment. Elizabeth, meanwhile, grew increasingly anxious as both the ceremony and her due date approached. Dr. Peterson monitored her closely, concerned that the stress might trigger early labor. "What if the baby comes before the 12th?" she asked Emma during one of their now daily visits. "No, what if I can't reach the junction in time?" "Then we'll find another way," Emma assured her, though in truth she had no idea what that might be. The junction's completion represented a unique convergence that might not be replicated for years, if ever. On the evening of November 11th, they gathered at the Cunningham home for final preparations. Sarah had traced the pattern from William's blanket onto a large sheet of paper, marking specific points she believed would need to align with the railway junction's layout. "The pattern isn't just decorative," she explained, indicating what appeared to be nodal points in the design. "These intersections represent what Grandfather called quantum anchors, points where reality itself becomes malleable." "And you believe these will align with the physical junction?" Dr. Peterson asked skeptically. "Not by chance," Sarah replied. "I think whoever created this pattern in Elizabeth's time knew exactly where and when it needed to be deployed. The junction's electromagnetic signature, combined with the temporal marker on the blanket, creates a specific window of opportunity." "But why?" James wondered. "Why send Elizabeth back to our time?" "I don't think they did. Not intentionally," Elizabeth said, one hand resting on her rounded stomach. "The museum guide said the patterns were experimental. I think I was an accident." Emma wasn't so certain. The blanket had come to William specifically, had been wrapped around her child as if meant for him. Such precision hardly seemed accidental. As if reading her thoughts, Sarah added, "There's something else. Grandfather wrote of temporal conservation, the universe's tendency to balance any disruption to the timeline." "Meaning what, exactly?" Dr. Peterson pressed. "Meaning that for Elizabeth to return to her time, something of equivalent value might need to remain here." A heavy silence fell over the room. Elizabeth's hand tightened protectively over her unborn child, while Emma instinctively moved closer to William's cradle. "No," James said firmly, "no exchanges. Elizabeth returns whole, or not at all." Sarah spread her hands apologetically. "I'm only reporting what Grandfather theorized. The universe seeks balance. That's all we know for certain." Later that night, as James slept beside her, Emma stared at the ceiling, unable to find rest. William's blanket lay across her chest, its pattern seeming to shift in the dim moonlight. What had drawn it to her child? What connection existed between William and Elizabeth's unborn baby? A soft knock at the bedroom door startled her. Carefully extracting herself from bed, Emma opened it to find Elizabeth standing in the hallway, her face pale in the darkness. "I couldn't sleep," the younger woman whispered. "May we talk?" They settled in the kitchen, where embers still glowed in the stove. Emma wrapped a shawl around Elizabeth's shoulders, noting how the girl trembled despite the room's warmth. "What if I don't want to go back?" Elizabeth said suddenly. Emma's hands stilled around the teacup she'd been preparing. "What do you mean?" "My life there. It wasn't good." Elizabeth stared into the stove's dying light. "My parents died when I was 14. I've been in foster care, bounced between homes. The baby's father wants nothing to do with us. I was going to give it up for adoption. And now? Now I've met you and James and the Petersons. I've seen how people care for each other here despite the hardships. Maybe this is where I'm meant to be." Emma sat beside her, choosing her words carefully. "Life in 1886 isn't easy, Elizabeth. There are diseases we can't cure, comforts you'd miss, freedoms women don't yet have. But there's community, connection." Elizabeth's hand found Emma's. "In my time, people live surrounded by others yet completely alone. They stare at devices all day instead of talking to each other. Everything moves so fast, there's no time to truly live." "And your child? What future would they have here?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "A simple one, a honest one, with people who would care." "People like us," Emma realized. Elizabeth was suggesting that she and James might raise her child if she decided to return alone. "What about Sarah's theory?" Emma asked gently. "About the universe requiring balance? What if the balance isn't about people, but choices? I choose to send something back in my place, the blanket, the medallion, symbols of what brought me here." The idea resonated with something Emma had felt since finding the blanket, that objects carried intentions, histories, purposes of their own. Perhaps the universe would accept such an exchange. "You should sleep," Emma finally said, helping Elizabeth to her feet. Tomorrow will demand all our strength, whatever you decide. Dawn broke clear and cold on November 12th, the sky a brilliant blue that promised perfect weather for the junction ceremony. By mid-morning, crowds had begun gathering at the newly completed Western Junction, where 5 railway lines converged in a feat of engineering that symbolized Topeka's growing importance. Emma, James and William arrived early, securing positions near the podium where railway officials would speak. Dr. Peterson followed with Elizabeth, who wore a heavy cloak to conceal both her condition and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Sarah joined them last, carrying a small leather satchel containing her grandfather's journals and instruments. "Remember," Sarah murmured as the ceremony began, "we must be precisely at the center of the junction at 11:12 and 45 seconds. James, can you get us there?" James nodded grimly. As a railway employee, he had access to areas the public would be barred from, but timing would be crucial. The final spike was scheduled to be driven at 11:15, meaning they would need to make their attempt just before the official culmination of the ceremony. At 11 now, the speeches began. Railway executives extolled the significance of the junction, politicians claimed credit for bringing progress to Kansas, and a band played patriotic tunes that almost, but not quite, drowned out the increasingly anxious conversation within their small group. "It's time," James said at 11:10, gesturing for them to follow him toward the tracks. They moved carefully through the crowd, James flashing his employee badge at security men who might have questioned their presence. At exactly 11:11, they reached the center point of the junction, where all 5 tracks converged. The final spike stood ready, waiting for the ceremonial hammer that would mark the junction's completion. "1 minute," Sarah whispered, checking her pocket watch. "Elizabeth, are you certain of your decision?" The young woman nodded, her face set with determination. After their late-night conversation, she had made her choice. She would stay in 1886, building a life for herself and her child in this simpler time. The blanket and medallion would return to 2023 without her, satisfying the universe's demand for balance. "The pattern," Sarah instructed, unfolding the diagram she'd prepared. "Align it with the tracks. Emma, the blanket needs to be at the center." Emma carefully positioned William's blanket on the ground, its strange pattern indeed matching the configuration of the converging rails. Elizabeth removed the medallion from around her neck, placing it at the center of the blanket. 30 seconds, Sarah announced, her voice tight with tension. The air around them seemed to thicken, a subtle pressure building as if a storm approached, though the sky remained clear. Emma felt the hairs on her arms rise, an electrical charge gathering around them. 15 seconds. The ground beneath the blanket began to shimmer, the pattern seeming to pulse with internal light. The medallion vibrated, spinning slowly at first, then faster. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. At exactly 11:12 and 45 seconds, several things happened simultaneously. The medallion emitted a blinding flash of light. A high-pitched tone, just at the edge of human hearing, rippled outward. The air above the blanket seemed to fold inward, creating what appeared to be a window opening onto somewhere, or somewhen, else. Through that impossible opening, Emma glimpsed a brightly lit room filled with strange devices and people in unusual clothing. A woman stood closest to their side of the opening, her eyes widening in shock as she saw them gathered around the railway junction. "Elizabeth!" the woman called, her voice distorted as if traveling through water. "Elizabeth Parker, is that you?" Elizabeth stepped forward, one hand protectively covering her stomach. "Dr. Hayes, you can see me?" "We've been searching for you for months," the woman, Dr. Hayes, replied. "The quantum bridge collapsed after you disappeared. We've been trying to re-establish contact using the original patterns." James gripped Emma's arm, pulling her and William back slightly from the shimmering portal. "This is madness," he whispered, though his voice held more awe than fear. "Dr." Peterson moved closer to Elizabeth, his scientific curiosity overcoming his disbelief. "This is your time, your world. Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at the familiar future she had decided to abandon. Yes. The connection is unstable, Dr. Hayes called urgently. We can hold it open for perhaps 30 seconds. Elizabeth, you need to come through now. I'm staying, Elizabeth called back, her voice firm despite her tears. I've made my decision. Dr. Hayes's expression shifted from relief to confusion. That's impossible. The temporal conservation law. The universe requires balance. Sarah stepped forward, Thomas Cunningham's journal clutched in her hands. If Elizabeth stays, what must return to maintain that balance? Dr. Hayes seemed to notice the others for the first time. Her eyes swept over James, Sarah, Emma with baby William, and Dr. Peterson before fixing on the blanket at their feet. The pattern matrix and the Cunningham medallion at minimum, she replied, but more likely, a person. Mass for mass, consciousness for consciousness. That's what our equations predict. Emma felt a chill run through her. She clutched William tighter, the baby surprisingly calm, despite the extraordinary events unfolding around him. 20 seconds before collapse! Someone shouted from behind Dr. Hayes. Elizabeth turned to Emma, her eyes filled with resolve. I've thought about this since last night. The blanket found William for a reason. It was never about me. I was just caught in the current. The connection is between your son and my baby. What are you saying? Emma asked, though a part of her already understood. My child belongs in your time. And William... Elizabeth's hand gently touched the baby's cheek. William was meant for more than Topeka in 1886. No, Emma gasped, pulling William closer. You can't mean... 15 seconds, the voice from the future called. Emma, James said softly, his hand on her shoulder. Look. The pattern on the blanket had begun to glow, lines of light tracing the complex design and reaching upward to encircle William in a gentle, luminous embrace. The baby cooed, reaching toward the light as if recognizing it. He knows, Sarah whispered. Somehow, he knows. Emma looked from her child to Elizabeth, tears blurring her vision. But he's my son. Our son. And he still will be, Elizabeth said gently, just in my time, where he can have opportunities we can't even imagine, where he might fulfill whatever purpose drew the pattern to him in the first place. 10 seconds, Dr. Hayes called through the portal. Elizabeth, we're detecting 2 consciousness signatures compatible with transit. Yours and the infant's. You must decide now. Emma felt James's arm around her, steadying her as the impossible choice loomed before them. What about Elizabeth's baby? She asked, her voice breaking. Due in 3 weeks, Dr. Peterson supplied. We could provide for it, raise it as our own. As William's replacement? Emma cried. No, James said firmly, as a child who needs us, just as William will need Elizabeth in her time. 5 seconds. The portal flickered, the edges of the opening beginning to close. William squirmed in Emma's arms, reaching toward the light with increased urgency. In that moment, Emma knew. The pattern had always been meant for William. The blanket had found him because he was never truly meant to remain in 1886. Some greater purpose awaited him in the future, a destiny only possible in Elizabeth's time. With trembling hands, she kissed her son's forehead one last time, breathing in his scent, memorizing the feel of his small body against hers. Take care of our boy, she whispered to Elizabeth, extending William toward her. Tell him we loved him enough to let him go. Elizabeth nodded solemnly, tears streaming down her face as she accepted the baby. I'll love him as my own, and when my child comes, We'll love your baby just the same, James promised, his voice rough with emotion. A fair exchange. 2 seconds. Elizabeth stepped toward the portal, William secure in her arms, the blanket wrapped around them both. She paused at the threshold between times, looking back one last time. His full name is William Thomas Whitaker, Emma called. Never let him forget. I won't, Elizabeth promised as she stepped through the shimmering doorway, and my daughter's name will be Emma. Emma Sarah Whitaker. The portal collapsed with a sound like thunder, the blanket and medallion vanishing with Elizabeth and William. Where they had stood, the railway junction remained unchanged, 5 tracks converging at a single point that had, for the briefest moment, connected 2 centuries. Emma fell to her knees, James kneeling beside her as they both stared at the empty space where their son had been. Dr. Peterson and Sarah stood in silent witness to their grief, the magnitude of what had transpired settling over them all. Was it real? Dr. Peterson finally asked, his scientific mind already struggling to rationalize what they had witnessed. Sarah clutched her grandfather's journal to her chest. As real as anything in this world. In the distance, cheers erupted as railway officials drove the ceremonial final spike into the junction, unaware that moments earlier a far more momentous connection had been forged on those same tracks. 3 weeks later, Emma sat beside Elizabeth's bed in the Peterson home, holding a newborn girl with eyes the same shade of blue as William's had been. The birth had been difficult but successful. Elizabeth's body weakened by her journey through time, but sustained by her determination to deliver her child safely into the world she had chosen. Emma, Sarah Whitaker, Elizabeth whispered, watching as the infant curled her tiny fingers around Emma's thumb. She has your spirit, I think, and your courage, Emma replied softly. She'll need both in this world. James appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle as he beheld his wife with their new daughter. The past weeks had been filled with grief for William, tempered by practical arrangements for Elizabeth and her coming child. They had created a story. Elizabeth was James's cousin from back east, widowed and sent to live with them for support. The people of Topeka, kind but incurious about others' misfortunes, accepted the tale without question. Doctor, Peterson says you can come home tomorrow, James told Elizabeth. Your room is ready. Elizabeth nodded gratefully. She would live with them as family, helping Emma with household duties as she regained her strength and learned to navigate this unfamiliar century. In time, she might marry again. Dr. Peterson's young assistant had already shown interest. But for now, she was content to be part of the Whitaker household, connected to them by bonds stronger than blood. That night, after everyone else had retired, Emma sat alone by the window, gazing up at the stars. Somewhere beyond those distant lights, in a future she would never see, her son was being cradled by another woman, wrapped in a blanket whose pattern had forever altered the course of 2 families across time. "Grow strong, William Thomas," she whispered to the night sky. "Know that we loved you enough to let you go." Inside the cradle beside her, little Emma Sarah stirred in her sleep, her tiny face peaceful in the moonlight. Not a replacement for the child they had lost, but a new beginning, a different pattern being woven into the fabric of their lives. Outside, a train whistle sounded in the distance, its mournful cry echoing across Topeka. But to Emma, it no longer seemed sorrowful. Instead, it spoke of journeys and connections, of patterns that stretched across time itself, binding together lives that were meant to intersect, however briefly, before continuing along their destined tracks. In 2023, in a quiet hospital room far from the Museum of Science and Technology, Elizabeth Parker Whitaker held a 6-month-old William Thomas against her shoulder, his curious eyes taking in the strange new world around him. On the wall hung a framed section of an antique blanket, its pattern preserved behind glass, a reminder of the impossible journey that had brought them together. "Your mother had hair just like yours," she told him softly, running her fingers through his dark curls. "And your father's eyes saw straight to the truth of things. They loved you enough to let you go, so that you might find your purpose here." William cooed in response, his small hand reaching toward the framed pattern as if recognizing something essential in its complex design. Dr. Hayes entered the room, carrying a tablet with William's latest test results. "It's remarkable," she said, shaking her head in wonder. "His neural patterns are completely unique, unlike anything we've ever recorded. The temporal transit seems to have altered his brain development in ways we're only beginning to understand. Will he be all right? Elizabeth asked, the familiar fear returning. Dr. Hayes smiled reassuringly. More than all right. Your son appears to have developed the ability to perceive patterns invisible to the rest of us, quantum relationships, temporal connections. As he grows, he may be able to see the very fabric of reality in ways that could revolutionize our understanding of time itself. Elizabeth gazed down at William, thinking of Emma and James in their distant past, of their sacrifice and the daughter they were raising in his place. He'll make them proud, she whispered, both his families. Outside the hospital window, a train passed on distant tracks, its whistle a brief reminder of another time, another place, where 5 railways once converged at a junction that, for one brief moment, had connected past and future through the impossible geometry of a pattern that shouldn't have existed, but did. And in that pattern, 2 families found their destinies intertwined across the vast expanse of time. Their lives forever altered by a blanket that carried within its woven threads the most profound message of all, that love, like time itself, follows patterns we may never fully comprehend, but must trust to lead us where we truly belong.